I'm proud to present part 2 of my conversation with former state commissioners Brisé and Simon and Paula Glover, president of the American Association of Blacks in Energy. In this dialogue, we will address our personal experiences and influence in promoting diversity and inclusion. Thank you, Commissioner Emeritus Tim Simon, for reminding us that companies need to hear the truth, and Paula Glover for always being the leader in speaking the truth. It's just the right thing to do.
Whether you were talking about a renewable portfolio standard or distributed generation or the expansion of the internet and Wi-Fi and broadband, I felt every one had a policy implication, and particularly for the rate-based cost of service type institutions, because in reality, they were rate funded. And too often, whether it was in their areas of procurement or their board of directors or their officers, it did not reflect the base that was funding them. And I believe a commissioner's ability to have a statement on that authorized rate of return, that cost of capital, and the other things that are essential to the shareholder side, which is very important. And that's the other thing. I think commissioners have to really understand why that credit rating is so critical to ratepayers. I was pro-infrastructure. That was on my bio. So what began to happen with me is I began to be painted as the diversity commissioner. And, my mother was born on Greenwood in Tulsa, my mother and grandmother. My family lived on Greenwood. My grandmother was roller skating with the gentleman that was the result for the riots that occurred in 1921. I knew about the riots all my life. And my father's from Lake Charles, and his father never worked for anybody else. He was a serial entrepreneur. And I was already rooted in the need to expand economic opportunity in this country. When I was a Bank of America attorney, I would just go out and find African-American firms and just push to make them outside approved law firms. I didn't even know what the policies was. I would just go get one and say, come on down, you're gonna talk to the general counsel. I knew when I got to the commission, and I became a commissioner at 51. So I was already a gray beard when I got there, I knew that one, commissions have a obligation for economic development. 2, they have a rate base. 3, they have a very low borrowing cost in terms of the utilities themselves. And Commissioner Brisé, I want to thank you for that Crystal River securitization, because a number of my clients, I had 4 clients that were involved in that, and Commissioner Brisé really stood up and put up a lot of political capital to make certain that, diversity was a part of it. But I knew that it's not a separate discussion about diversity and inclusion. It is intertwined. It is matriculated into every aspect of the utility regulatory policy framework. We just have to become more comfortable to talk about it. And I see a young breed of commissioners coming up in NARUC, diverse commissioners who are fearless. And I'm very excited about that future. But what I've learned is that you have to keep pushing the agenda, because if not, the needle goes right back to the status quo. It is a never-ending 24/7 fight. And I think we have an opportunity now to see more awareness of why we have this disparity in society. But history has shown that there has always been a retaliation. And I think it's important that that is kept in mind, that there are those in America that want America to look a certain way. And it may not include us. And we have to be able to actually dialogue with them as well, to gain support, to find common ground. So that was my view as a commissioner. And it hasn't changed much today. I mean, as a business person, I'm no longer a regulator. I oftentimes cannot take the positions that I would like, because I have clients that are doing business, or I'm doing business with some of these entities. But I think they're better served with the truth. I still feel that's the case. Entities pay hundreds of millions of dollars to just get market data that's telling them the truth. Why not tell the truth about the history? I think our shareholders would be happier if they were operating with the truth.
Thank you, Commissioner. So, Paula, in that regard, shareholders, out of the tragic deaths of George Floyd, Ahmaud Arbery, and Breonna Taylor, and Mr. Brooks in Atlanta, and at least the 2 or 3 others since we first engaged about having this conversation, out of those tragic deaths, I hope that we can seize an opportunity to carry these conversations forward in our own way and in our own space. And as I think about corporations that are regulated by state commissions, I did notice a quick flurry of activity and a race. I mean, I was proud of everyone, a race to issue statements, a race to look within to really drill down on whatever diversity and inclusion programs they had within. And I think that there's a place for corporate America to carry that forward, not to react in the short term and then forget about it. So from your perspective, working with the member companies, what are your observations?
I think they mirror those. I would say there are a lot of companies who aren't quite sure what they're supposed to be doing. And I would suggest that this moment is so much larger than just our normal D&I programs. And actually, D&I programs don't even scratch the surface of what we're dealing with. And what I advise companies is that, listen, we are talking about hundreds of years of inequity that you are not going to change with a workforce development program. You're just not. I mean, if we're talking about systemic problems, then you've got to come up with systemic solutions. And that means that companies have to be really committed to doing a lot of self-work. The association and my chair and I, we issued a statement. And one of the things that we said first was that as an industry, it is time for us to get our houses in order. And what we meant by that is it's time for us to be honest about what our organizations are, how we treat our employees, specifically how do you treat your African-American employees and what the truth of that is. And I think you're starting to see more companies who are really taking that kind of focus, right? That they're saying, okay, let's really talk about what is racism in this organization. Does racism exist? Yeah, it does. It exists in just about anyone. And that's not to blame anybody. That's just the reality of this world that we live in. But that leaders now have an obligation to figure out what that looks like in their companies. Where does it reside? And how am I going to change all of that before I ever get into this process of bringing more people in? I think all of us from where we sit could say that working in some of these constructs and organizations is exhausting. It is emotionally exhausting to go in there every single day sometimes. But this is the time that I think we all have to be a lot stronger and like really plow through. And I think to Tim's point, tell the truth about what is what and what's happening. And the other thing is, you know, for a long time, you'll all remember that we used to talk about diversity and we started with, well, it's just the right thing to do. And then we moved to, well, we need to build the business case, right? Companies that have diverse boards and more women on boards, et cetera, you make more money and blah, 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 and all of that. And I got to tell you, in today's environment, I've gone back to what's wrong with it's just the right thing to do. Like, I don't think I should have to explain anything else to you except do the right thing. And it is not right, what we are seeing. This disenfranchisement that hits communities, Black communities first and then others, is just wrong. And I think for our corporate leaders, you are no longer allowed to check out and act like you're not impacted, that you are unaffected, or that you cannot affect change. Neither one of those are options anymore. And so I think the good news is that there are a lot of companies who are kind of coming to grips with that, right? That it used to be, well, that's social unrest and I run a business and so I don't have to worry about it. Well, you got to worry about it now. I think that is the blessing of us being in a pandemic, right? There was no way for us to get up the next morning after Breonna Taylor was murdered and go about our business like that never happened. We were all home watching the news day after day after day. Right? 15, 16 days of straight protests. It's in our face. And so, yeah, companies have got to step up, and they are starting to step up. They really are. But I'll say one more thing. And I think for all of you as ex-commissioners, the power of asking the question is that is your superpower, right? Having been a lobbyist for a company on the other side, all you ever needed was a commissioner to ask you a question that you could not answer, because that question was always a signal to your priorities. And just as organizations were planning, what do I want in my next rate case? What kind of thing am I going to try? I want the commission to sanction. What do I think is good for my business? I think real hard about presenting that to a commission if I know that the things that are most important to those who sit on the bench are not the issues that I'm addressing. Absolutely. Right? That's really... And I've had companies say, you shouldn't say that. And I'm like, why? Because I know it's true. I've been on the other hand of running around to try to resolve an issue that my company did not address because a commissioner asked a question and nobody wanted to go back there and not have the right answer.
Yeah, all three of us, I think, can attest to that. You are so right, Paula. And we've even observed the opposite, where you can innocently ask a question, people start running around, and you're like, I was just wondering. But,
right.
I was just thinking out loud.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah,
People start programs off a question.
Yep.
Yeah. That's the power of the dais. So two things. I have to tell you that same philosophy is true at the board table, not just from the dais of the regulators. And so Ron has heard me talk about this probably more than he'd like, but it's important to have a seat at the table. And even if it's not you at the table, but someone who looks like you at the table, because you need a champion. And there are different definitions and, and thoughts about what that looks like. But I always say, mirroring, frankly, from people who are smarter than me, that we might not have a diversity problem, but we have an inclusion problem, right? And so even if you can't be at the table, if there's a champion at the table, things can only get better. And so in that regard, Paula, do your member companies ask your advice about who their next board person should be and what characteristics should they be looking at? Because I just from my own opinion, I think that kind of inclusion has to start from the very top.
Yeah, they don't necessarily ask me for specific recommendations, for example, although that has happened. I won't say it's never happened, but it's rare. But what I do hear from the Korn Ferries and the Russell Reynolds of the world is that they do absolutely go to them and say, you have to present me a slate of candidates that's diverse. Some companies have gone so far as to say, you need to present me a slate of candidates who are African American. I don't want a diverse slate because that means it's a much broader group. I'm looking for something really specific. And I think the good thing about that is that it really challenges the narrative of there's nobody out there, right? We've all heard it's so hard to fill that role. It's hard to find African American engineer. It's hard to find a female chemist. It's just really tough. And I would say it actually ain't that tough. It's not hard. But if you look in the same places that you always look and find some new stuff, I think that is a definition of what's wrong with you, not what's wrong with the pool. Representation on corporate boards is not even close to where it needs to be. And there are so many associations, ELC being one, my association being other, the Brisé, tons of us who are trying to figure out how to crack that nut. But at the end of the day, it's the company's job, and we will help you find the people who check those boxes. The only thing that you ask, I think, for any search, whether that's a corporate board, an executive search, whatever, is that organizations are truthful about what they really need versus what they'd like to have because the last person had it. Mm-hmm. And in every job, there's always the job description that has 20 things that you have to have when really only 5 of them matter. And the other 15 are stuff I just threw in there just because someone else did it. And I think that might be nice. And I think our job is to push back and say, okay, so when you hand me this 3-page job description, what exactly do you need? Because you got to know you're not going to find one person who has every single thing that you've got listed to perfection. And so our obligation is to push back and ask those kinds of questions to force them to be more thoughtful about what their requests are, what their asks are, and then at the same time to assist them in really getting what they need.